Beamy Jade, 26. Have a boyfriend named Owen. We've been together for almost 2 years at this point. Owen works some boring IT job, pays his half of rent without complaining, never yells, never makes scenes. From the outside, we probably look like a totally functional couple. That's the thing, though. The outside was fine. It was everything underneath that was the problem. And I was the only one who could see it. At least that's what I believed for a very long time. Let me back up a little. When we first started dating, Owen seemed great. Calm, stable, showed up when he said he would. I remember telling my friend that he was refreshingly uncomplicated, which, looking back, was probably the first sign I was ignoring something. Because uncomplicated isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it just means someone isn't doing the work. Owen wasn't doing the work. I became more and more convinced of this as the months went on. The thing about toxic masculinity is that it doesn't always look like aggression. It doesn't have to be loud or violent to be harmful. Sometimes it's the silence, the emotional unavailability, the refusal to examine yourself and grow as a person. And Owen had all of that, in my opinion. He just wouldn't open up. He wouldn't talk about his feelings, his fears, his vulnerabilities. Every time I tried to have a deeper conversation, he'd give short answers and then go back to whatever he was doing. I found that incredibly frustrating. I want to be clear that I'm not someone who just complains without trying to fix things. I read a lot. I follow a lot of people who talk about healthy relationships, communication, emotional intelligence. I tried to model what good emotional expression looks like. I shared my feelings constantly, sometimes at length. I explained to Owen more than once that men are conditioned from childhood to suppress their emotions, and that this is damaging not just to themselves, but to everyone around them. He would listen, or at least, he looked like he was listening. Then he'd say something like, "Okay," or "I hear you," and nothing would change, which honestly felt worse than if he'd argued back. There were specific things that bothered me about how he operated. Like when I'd had a hard day and wanted to vent, he'd listen for a while and then try to offer some kind of solution. I never asked for solutions. I asked for him to be present, to just hear me. I told him this more than once, and he'd adjust for a bit but eventually go back to the same thing. It felt like he couldn't help trying to fix things instead of just being with me in the feeling. That's a very common trait in men who haven't done any real self-work. I recognized it immediately. And then there was the way he handled disagreements. Or rather, the way he didn't handle them. If we got into a tense conversation, he'd go very still and quiet. Not in a thoughtful way, in an avoidant way. He'd give short responses, answer only what I directly asked, not volunteer anything. I called it stonewalling once, and he said he just didn't know what to say. I said that not knowing what to say was also a choice, that choosing silence when your partner needs engagement was a form of withholding. He thought about that for a second, and then said, "Okay," which, again, proved my point. My friends were noticing it too. Not that I was venting to them constantly or anything, but when things came up naturally in conversation, they'd agree that what I was describing sounded exhausting. One of them said that Owen sounded emotionally stunted, and that was honestly the most accurate description I'd heard. Another one told me she'd gone through something similar with a guy, and that therapy had been the only thing that actually moved the needle. Couples therapy, or just getting him into individual therapy, either way. The idea lodged in my brain, and I kept coming back to it. What really pushed me over the edge into actually doing something was a specific evening. We were at a dinner, some of my close friends. Owen was there. A conversation came up. I don't even fully remember what it was about exactly. Something that was being discussed in the group. And Owen said pretty casually that he saw it differently. Not aggressively, not rudely, just said he thought about it another way. In front of everyone. I felt my face go warm immediately. Not because what he said was wrong or offensive, but because I hadn't expected it. and it put me in a position I didn't like. Like I was suddenly on the opposite side of a thing from my own boyfriend, publicly. I didn't say anything at the table, but in the car going home, I brought it up. He seemed genuinely confused about what the issue was. I explained that timing and context matter, that a dinner with my friends isn't the place to introduce disagreement, that it puts me in an uncomfortable spot. He said he wasn't trying to embarrass me, he just thought it was a normal conversation. I said that intention doesn't erase impact. He went quiet after that. I took the quiet as him understanding. Now I'm not so sure what it was. Anyway, the therapy idea became more and more concrete over the following weeks. Owen would never bring it up on his own. That much was obvious. Men like him don't seek help because they've been told their whole lives that needing help is weakness. That's literally how the conditioning works. So, if I waited for him to suggest it, we'd be waiting forever. I decided that if I actually cared about this relationship, and I did, then I needed to be the one to take action. I researched therapists for probably 2 weeks. I wasn't looking for just anyone. I wanted someone who understood relationship dynamics, communication issues, emotional availability, someone who would be equipped to see what I was seeing and help Owen understand it from a different angle. I found Dr. Sloan. Her profile talked about helping people develop emotional attunement, breaking down patterns of avoidance, building healthier communication habits. It sounded exactly like what we needed, what Owen needed. I booked the appointment. I told Owen about it over dinner. I explained that I'd found a therapist I thought could really help us, that I'd already made the appointment, and that I hoped he'd come with me. He looked at me for a second and asked if I was sure this was necessary. I told him yes, absolutely, and that his resistance to the idea was itself part of the pattern I was talking about. Men who need the most help are usually the most resistant to getting it. He didn't argue. He said fine, he'd go. I took that as a good sign. I told my friends that night, and they were all supportive. One of them said, finally, maybe someone professional can get through to him since you clearly can't do it alone. That was more or less what I was hoping for. The appointment was a few weeks out. In that time, things between me and Owen were fine on the surface. We didn't fight about anything major. He was doing what he always did, going to work, coming home, making dinner occasionally, watching whatever he watched. I was still frustrated by the same underlying things, but I was holding on to the therapy appointment like a lifeline. I genuinely believed it was going to change something. Dr. Sloan was going to see what I was seeing and help Owen understand it from a place he could actually receive. I'd read that sometimes people can't hear hard truths from their partners, but they can hear them from a neutral third party. A professional carries a different kind of weight. That's basically what I was counting on. I also have to be honest that I did some preparation. Not scripting or anything manipulative, just organizing my thoughts. I wanted to be able to articulate clearly what the issues were without getting emotional or losing the thread. I thought about specific examples I could give. The dinner incident, the solution offering instead of listening, the quiet withdrawal during conflict. I made mental notes of all of it. I wanted Dr. Sloan to have a clear picture from the start. The morning of the appointment, I was nervous in a hopeful way. I picked out what I was going to wear, made sure I had time to eat breakfast properly, went over the main points in my head again. Owen got ready without much comment. On the drive over, he was quiet, which was normal for him. I tried to start a conversation about what I hoped we'd get out of the session. He said he just wanted to hear what the therapist had to say. I told him that was a healthy attitude. He nodded. Dr. Sloan's office was on the second floor of a small building. Nothing fancy. The waiting area had those chairs that are too soft and a water dispenser humming in the corner. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes before she came out to get us. She was younger than I expected. Professional looking, calm energy, gave off the impression that she'd heard everything before and nothing would surprise her. We went into her office and sat across from her on a small couch. She introduced herself, explained briefly how she worked, said this was a space for both of us to speak openly without judgment. Then she asked what brought us in. I started talking. I explained that Owen struggled with emotional availability, that I'd been trying to address this for a long time, that his upbringing had probably given him certain ideas about how men are supposed to act, that it was affecting our relationship and his ability to connect on a meaningful level. I gave the dinner example. I gave the solution offering example. I talked about the quiet withdrawal. I laid it all out clearly, I thought. Dr. Sloan listened, made a couple of notes, and then she said she'd like to hear from Owen. He talked, for longer than I expected him to. I'd honestly assumed he'd give the same short answers he always gave me, but he didn't. Something about being in that room with someone neutral seemed to open him up in a way I'd never managed to, which was its own frustrating thing to notice, that he could talk to a stranger, but not to me. But I pushed that thought aside and listened. He said that he often felt like the relationship operated on a dynamic where his perspective didn't carry much weight. He said that disagreeing with me tended to result in long conversations where he was expected to eventually come around to my view. He said that decisions that affected both of us were sometimes already made before he was told about them. He gave the therapy appointment as an example of that. He said he'd tried to bring up his own feelings about things a few times, and it usually turned into a discussion about why he was wrong to feel that way, or what was behind those feelings that he hadn't examined. He said after a while he just stopped bringing things up because it wasn't worth the energy. He was saying all of this very calmly, no drama, no anger, just describing things as he experienced them. I wanted to respond. I had responses ready for most of what he said, but Dr. Sloan held up a hand slightly and said she'd like to hear him finish. That was a little annoying, but I let it go. When he was done, she turned to me and started asking questions, not the kind I was expecting. She asked whether the appointment had been something Owen had requested or something I'd arranged on my own. I said I'd arranged it because he never would have done it himself, and someone had to take that step. She asked what specifically I meant when I said Owen was emotionally unavailable. I gave examples again, the short answers, the not wanting to talk about feelings, the not opening up. She asked whether he'd ever told me directly that he didn't want to discuss certain things, or whether he just didn't match the level of emotional conversation I was looking for. I said those were kind of the same thing, and that if he were emotionally healthy, he'd want to have those conversations. She wrote something down. Then she asked about the dinner incident. She asked me to walk her through what actually happened. I explained that we were at a gathering with some of my friends, and a topic came up, and Owen said he saw it differently, in front of everyone. She asked if he'd been rude or aggressive about it. I said no, but the point wasn't the manner, it was the context. She asked what was embarrassing about a partner having a different opinion. I said it just wasn't the time or place, that there's an understanding between partners about how you present as a unit. She asked whether partners are expected to agree publicly, even when they don't. I said that wasn't exactly what I meant, but I also couldn't immediately explain what I did mean in a way that sounded the way I intended. She went back and forth between us for a while after that. More questions, more note-taking. Owen answered when she asked him things and was quiet otherwise. I noticed he looked more relaxed in that room than I'd seen him look in a while, and I didn't entirely know how to feel about that. At one point, Dr. Sloan asked me to describe what a successful outcome of therapy would look like from my perspective. I said that Owen would become more communicative, more open about his feelings, more willing to examine where his behavior comes from and how it affects me. She asked if there was anything I hoped to work on myself. I said I was already pretty self-aware and that I'd been doing a lot of personal growth work for years. The room went quiet for a moment. Owen didn't say anything. Dr. Sloan just nodded and wrote something. Near the end of the session, She summarized what she'd observed. She did it in that careful, measured therapist language, but the content was not what I'd come there for. She said that from what she was hearing, Owen showed up consistently, managed conflict without hostility, and had communicated his needs on multiple occasions. She said what she was observing more clearly was a pattern where one partner's emotional framework was being applied as the standard for both people, and where the other partner's experience was being analyzed and reframed rather than accepted. She said she didn't see evidence of avoidance or toxic patterns in Owen's behavior. What she did see was someone who communicated differently than his partner, and who had, over time, learned that expressing his own perspective reliably created friction. She said there was a word for that, and the word was adaptation, not avoidance. I waited for her to turn to Owen and give him his portion of the feedback. I waited for the part where she told him what he needed to work on. That part didn't come. I asked her directly. I said something like, "But you can see that he has difficulty with emotional presence. That's clearly something we need to address." She said that emotional presence takes different forms, and that from what she'd heard today, Owen had expressed his perspective and his needs multiple times, and found that doing so led to being told he was wrong, that his feelings had deeper causes he hadn't examined, or that the timing was inappropriate. She said that wasn't emotional absence. That was a person who had learned that speaking up cost more than staying quiet. I felt my face get warm. I told her I wasn't sure she was looking at this objectively. She asked what I meant. I said, "Look, you're a woman. You work with people in relationships every day. You have to understand where I'm coming from here." She looked at me steadily and said that her job wasn't to validate a particular experience as the correct one. It was to look honestly at what was happening between two people. I said that felt dismissive. She said she understood it might feel that way, and that wasn't her intention. She wasn't dismissing me. She was reflecting what she actually observed. Owen still hadn't said anything, just sitting there with his hands folded. The session ended. Dr. Sloan gave us information about follow-up options, said both individual and joint sessions were available. Owen stood up and thanked her. I said something polite and automatic. We walked out. Outside on the street, the air felt different than it had when we'd walked in. I told Owen that I thought she'd missed the point entirely. He didn't respond. I said the whole session had been framed wrong from the beginning, and I was going to find someone better, someone who actually understood the full picture. He said quietly that maybe she did understand the full picture. I told him that wasn't helpful, and that it felt like he was taking her side against me. He said he wasn't taking anyone's side. I said that silence was a side. He said he was tired. We got in the car. I didn't sleep well that night. Owen barely spoke through the evening. Not the normal quiet, something heavier than that. I tried twice to restart the conversation, to explain what I'd meant, to give context for the things I'd said in the session that had come out wrong. He said he understood what I was saying. He just didn't respond much beyond that. I eventually stopped trying, and we went to bed without really resolving anything. I told myself it would be better in the morning. That was how it usually worked. A difficult night, and then morning, and then we'd start fresh. I fell asleep genuinely believing that. He wasn't there in the morning. His side of the closet looked the same at first glance, but then I noticed the gaps. His good jacket was gone. The toiletry bag from the bathroom counter was gone. His laptop bag, which usually sat next to the desk, was gone. The charger he kept plugged in on his nightstand was gone. I stood in the bedroom for a while, just looking at those spaces. There's something specific about the absence of a phone charger that makes a thing feel final in a way that other absences don't. I called him. Rang 4 times and then voicemail. I called again immediately. Same. I sent a message saying, "Where are you?" and watched it say delivered. I sent another one saying we need to talk and watched it also say delivered. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I waited about an hour and then called again. Voicemail. I left one this time, kept my voice calm, said I wasn't angry, and I just wanted to understand what was happening. The rest of that day, I kept checking my phone. Nothing came back. By late afternoon, I noticed that my messages had stopped showing anything at all when I sent them. No delivered, nothing. Which meant I'd been blocked. I went to look at his profile and couldn't find it. I tried a different way. Also, nothing. Everything was gone. I wasn't panicking, I was telling myself. I kept saying to myself that he just needed space, that he was processing, that by the next day he'd reach out and we could actually have the conversation that the therapy session should have been. I called one of my friends and told her what was happening. She immediately said this was textbook avoidant behavior and that I shouldn't chase him, that it would only make things worse. She said give it a few days. I said I hoped she was right. A few days turned into a week. I went to his place at some point during that week. I don't fully know what I was expecting to find. I knocked, no answer. I knocked again, nothing. His neighbor came out of her door and I asked if she'd seen him. She said she had. Not that long ago, he'd had a bag with him and was carrying it to his car. I thanked her and walked back to my car. I sat there for a while before driving home. I reached out to one of his friends eventually, a guy I'd met a handful of times at different things. I sent him a message, and he responded fairly quickly, said he'd heard from Owen that Owen was okay, and that he needed time. I asked how much time. He said he genuinely didn't know. I said I needed more than that. I needed to understand what was happening, and I asked him to tell Owen that I wasn't going to wait around forever without any communication at all. He said he'd pass it along. I don't know if he did or what Owen said in response because the friend didn't follow up and I didn't push it. More weeks went by. At some point, I made a separate account and wrote Owen a long message. I tried to be calm and reasonable in it. I said I understood he needed space. I said I wasn't trying to pressure him. I said I just needed some kind of response, even a short one, to know where things stood. I don't know if he read it. The account I'd used wasn't blocked, so technically it could have reached him. But there was no reply. I wrote one more a few days later, shorter, just asking for closure. Still nothing. After that, I stopped writing. My friends were consistent and supportive throughout all of this in the way good friends are. He wasn't right for you. He clearly had commitment issues. Him running like this proves what you were saying about his emotional unavailability. I held on to those things because I needed to. But there were other moments, usually late at night, where different thoughts crept in that I couldn't fully dismiss. The thing Dr. Sloan had said about adaptation kept coming back to me. She'd been so specific about it. Not avoidance, adaptation. The distinction felt important in a way I hadn't wanted to accept in the room. Avoidance means the person is running from something inside themselves. Adaptation means the person changed their behavior in response to what was around them, in response to me. I started going back through specific memories, not to punish myself, just trying to see them clearly. The conversation after the dinner, where I'd told him it was embarrassing for him to disagree in front of people. At the time, I'd been sure that was a reasonable thing to say, but when I tried to look at it from the outside, from the perspective of someone who'd been told they weren't allowed to disagree with their partner publicly, it landed differently. Not catastrophically different, but different. There was another one I kept returning to. A time when Owen had said, kind of carefully, that he'd been feeling a little overwhelmed lately and wasn't sure why. I'd listened for a minute and then started asking him questions about his sleep habits, his workload, whether he'd been drinking enough water, whether his stress response was connected to patterns from his childhood. I was trying to help. I genuinely thought I was helping. He'd said he just needed to get it off his chest and wasn't really looking for an analysis. I'd said that just getting it off your chest without examining the root cause was how problems stayed unresolved. He'd said, yeah, okay, and then stopped talking about it. I'd thought he was being defensive. Now I wondered if he'd just wanted to feel heard for a minute and instead had gotten a diagnosis. These thoughts weren't comfortable. I didn't share them with my friends because it would have come out wrong. They would have told me I was being too hard on myself, or alternatively that it confirmed I deserved better, and neither of those would have actually helped me figure out what I was actually thinking. So I kept them separate and just sat with them on my own. Eventually, I started seeing a therapist myself. Not Dr. Sloan, someone different. Someone I found on my own and chose for myself, without a specific goal in mind. In one of our early sessions, I was going through the whole story, the relationship, the appointment, everything after. I told it the way I'd been telling it to my friends. My therapist listened and then asked me a question that I hadn't expected at all. She asked how it felt when Owen started speaking in that session with Dr. Sloan. Not what I thought about what he said. How it felt to hear him speaking that freely and that much. I said it was surprising. She asked why. I said because he never talked like that with me. She asked if I had any thoughts about why that might be. I didn't answer right away. That question stayed with me for a while after that session. Why had he talked in that room and not with me? I had a ready answer, which was that he needed a neutral party to feel safe enough to open up. But there was another possible answer underneath that one. That, with a neutral party, there was no risk of being told that his feelings were symptoms of something, or that the timing was wrong, or that he needed to examine what was beneath them before he was allowed to just have them. That, with Dr. Sloan in the room, he could just say what he'd observed, and it would be received as exactly what it was. That was something he apparently didn't have with me. I'm still going to therapy. It's been a few months now. Some sessions are harder than others. There are things that have come up that I didn't expect to come up. Like the way I tend to assume I understand what someone is experiencing better than they do. Like the way I frame disagreement as evidence of someone's dysfunction rather than as just a difference. Like the way I'd constructed an entire theory about Owen before I'd actually sat still long enough to hear what he was saying. These aren't easy things to look at directly. I'm not saying I was the villain in this. I don't think that's a useful way to look at it. I think I genuinely loved Owen and genuinely believed I was helping and got a lot of things wrong in ways I couldn't see at the time. That's harder to hold than either clean version. The version where I was right or the version where I was the problem. The real version is just more complicated and less satisfying than either of those. There is a sweater of his in a box in my apartment, a plain gray one. It ended up in my stuff, and I found it when I was clearing things out a couple months after he left. I put it in a box, and I still haven't done anything with it. I keep meaning to figure out a way to get it back to him, but I haven't. I don't know what that means exactly. Probably something. I've thought about reaching out one more time. Not to restart anything, just to say something. I don't really know what I'd say. I had things I wanted to say right after, but those feel different now. More honest, maybe, but also harder to put into words. And he's still blocked everywhere, so it would have to go through his friend, and that feels like too many steps. Dr. Sloan had said something near the end of the session, right before things went sideways. She said that two people can both be trying and still not be working. Not because either of them is broken, just because what they're each building is different, and those things don't fit together. I think about that a lot, actually. At the time, I heard it as her dismissing the relationship as not worth saving. Now I think she was saying something more specific, that you can care about someone and still be the wrong environment for them, that someone can be good and still be someone you're not good for. That's a harder idea to carry, but I think it's probably closer to true. Owen never called. Not once. I stopped checking as often after a while, but I still check sometimes. Still blocked everywhere. I don't expect that to change. I think he made a decision in that car on the drive home, and he stuck to it the way he stuck to everything else. Quietly, without a lot of drama, completely. The last thing I said to him was in that message from the other account. Something about needing closure. I don't know if he read it. If he did, I don't know what he made of it. He was always hard to read. That was the thing I used to say. I said it so often, I stopped noticing I was saying it. Hard to read. But I wonder now if he was actually that hard to read. Or if I'd just decided what I was going to see before I looked. Actually, let me back up even further, because there's context I left out. Owen and I met through mutual friends. One of those situations where you end up at the same birthday dinner and end up talking for most of the night. He was easy to talk to in a way that felt different from a lot of guys I'd met. He wasn't performing anything, wasn't trying to impress me, just talked normally, like a person. I liked that about him immediately. The first few months were good. He'd plan things and follow through, not in a grand way, just the regular things that add up over time. He remembered what I'd said I wanted to see and got tickets, remembered when I was nervous about something at work and checked in later. I'm not saying he was perfect, but the early part of the relationship didn't have the problems I started to see later. Or maybe the problems were always there, and I just wasn't looking for them yet. The shift happened gradually. I got more involved in some communities online that were talking a lot about emotional labor and relationship dynamics and the ways traditional masculinity creates problems for everyone. I'm not saying that was wrong to engage with, but I think somewhere in there I started looking at Owen through a different lens, started cataloging things, started noticing the ways he fit patterns I'd been reading about. And once you start seeing someone through a framework, it's hard to take the framework off and just see the person again. There was a night, maybe 8 or 9 months into the relationship, where I'd gone to a talk with some friends. It was about communication in relationships, breaking down unhealthy patterns, that kind of thing. I came home pretty fired up about it. Owen was on the couch watching something. I started telling him everything I'd heard and how much of it applied to us. He muted the TV and listened. At some point I said something about how the pattern of men not engaging emotionally puts all the labor on women, and asked him what he thought about that in the context of our relationship. He said he wasn't sure he saw it that way, that he thought he did try to engage, but maybe in different ways than I was expecting. I told him that was exactly what someone would say if they hadn't really examined it yet. He asked what examining it would look like. I said therapy or reading, or at minimum being willing to have harder conversations without shutting down. He said he wasn't shutting down. He was sitting there talking to me. I said the defensiveness in that response was part of what I was describing. He took a breath and said, okay. We didn't fight about it, but we also didn't actually get anywhere. I went to bed feeling like I'd tried and he'd resisted. I don't know what he went to bed feeling. The solution offering thing was a real source of friction. I know I mentioned it already, but it was ongoing enough that it deserves more detail. Owen's instinct, when I was upset or stressed, was to try to fix the practical problem. I'd say I was overwhelmed at work, and he'd ask if I'd talk to my manager or whether I could push a deadline. I'd say I was having a hard time with a friend's situation, and he'd say something like, well, have you told her that directly? I told him repeatedly that I didn't want solutions. I wanted him to be present with me in the feeling. He tried to adjust. For a while, he'd catch himself mid-sentence and stop and just say, that sounds really hard, or something like that. But I could tell it wasn't natural for him, and that he was stopping himself from saying what he actually thought, which I pointed out. I said it felt performative when he was clearly holding back his real response. He said he was trying to do what I asked. I said I wanted him to actually feel differently, not just perform feeling differently. He got a look on his face at that point that I didn't have a name for at the time, like something behind the eyes going very still. He said he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with that. I said that was the whole point, that the work was figuring that out. He said, okay, That word became something I noticed more and more. Okay. He used it constantly in those kinds of conversations. Just okay, like a door closing quietly. I told him once that okay wasn't a real response, that it was a way of ending a conversation without actually engaging with it. He said sometimes he didn't have more than that. I said that was the problem in a nutshell. He said okay again. I don't know if he did it deliberately. His friends were pretty invisible to me throughout the relationship. He had them, I knew that much. He'd see them occasionally for things, games or food or whatever, but he kept that part of his life pretty separate. I didn't push on it too much at the time, but now I wonder if that was deliberate. Like maybe he needed a space where the version of him that I was describing as the problem wasn't the version that existed. I don't know his friends well enough to know what he was like around them, but I'd guess different than he was around me by the end. There was also the thing about his family. Owen was close with his parents, talked to his dad fairly regularly. I met them a couple of times and they were fine, normal people. But I'd tried a few times to have conversations with Owen about his relationship with his dad and what he'd learned about being a man from growing up in that house. He said it was pretty straightforward. His dad worked hard, they did things together, no real drama. I said that the absence of obvious drama didn't mean the environment hadn't instilled certain ideas about masculinity and emotional expression. He thought about that and said maybe, but he didn't really know what I wanted him to say about it. I said I wanted him to explore it. He said he wasn't sure what that meant in practice. I said therapy would help with that. And that was sort of how that conversation planted the seed for the appointment. The 2 weeks I spent researching therapists were genuinely motivated by wanting things to get better. I want to be clear about that, because the way things turned out, it might look like I was setting something up. I wasn't. I was trying to find the right person. I read profiles carefully. I looked at what different therapists said about their approaches. I was trying to find someone who would be good at exactly the kind of work I thought Owen needed to do. Dr. Sloan's profile was genuinely the one that sounded the most relevant. I made the appointment because I thought it was the right move. I still think the impulse was right, even if the outcome wasn't what I expected. The thing I keep coming back to, though, is that I made the appointment without asking him. I told him about it. I gave him the information. I asked him to come. But the decision had already been made. He'd asked if I was sure it was necessary, and I'd told him his resistance was part of the problem. So the only acceptable answer was, yes, I'll go. There wasn't really a version where he said no thanks, and that was fine. I didn't see that at the time. Now it sits differently. During the session, when Dr. Sloan asked if there was anything I wanted to work on in myself, I said I was already pretty self-aware. I've thought about that moment a lot. Not because it was wrong to say at the time, but because of how easily and automatically I said it, without hesitating, without qualifying it, without leaving any room. Just, I'm already self-aware. And then I waited for her to turn her attention back to Owen. I wonder what she wrote down when I said that. The aftermath of the session was its own strange thing. The night Owen went quiet, and then the morning he wasn't there. The charger on the nightstand, the calls going to voicemail. I've thought a lot about the moment he made that decision. Whether it was in the session itself, or on the drive home, or after I pushed again that night. I think it might have been in the session, when Dr. Sloan said what she said, and he sat there quietly. He might have already known at that point. And then the rest was just details. There's something particular about being blocked completely. No last word, no explanation, no argument, just gone. I'd thought of that kind of total exit as something dramatic people did, something loud. But Owen's version was silent, which was somehow more absolute than if he'd slammed a door. He just stopped, completely. And the stillness of it was almost hard to process. I'm 26 years old, and I've been in a few relationships before this one. Nothing had ended quite like this. Usually there was a conversation, even a bad one. There was a point where you knew where you stood, even if where you stood was nowhere. This one just closed, and that was it. The sweater in the box is the only physical thing he left. I don't know what Owen is doing now. I hope he's okay. That's not a performance. I actually do. Whatever I got wrong and how I treated him, the basic feeling behind it was that I wanted things to be good. I wanted us to work. I wanted him to be better, and I wanted to be the reason. That last part, I've been sitting with that. I wanted to be the reason. Maybe some of what felt like caring was also something else. Being the one who understood something he couldn't see. Being right about what the problem was. I don't fully know. My therapist asked me once what the relationship had given me. Not what I'd put into it. What it had given me. I listed the obvious things, and then she asked me to think about less obvious things. One of the things that came up was that it had given me a project, a person to explain things to try to fix, to apply what I was learning to. She didn't say anything after I said that. She just let it sit there. I'm working on what that means. Owen never called. I've said that already, but it stays true the more time passes. Not once. There's a particular thing about a phone that never rings. You get used to the absence, but it doesn't stop being an absence. The gray sweater is still in the box. I'll deal with it eventually.